Good morning, everybody, and bună dimineața, as we say here in Romania, as I hopefully pronounced that right. Today we're continuing something we started last week. If you haven't seen the vlog last week, I'll link it up here. Last week we photographed locally. I photographed a sunrise over the beautiful city of Brasov, up from the Black Tower down towards the Black Church and the city center, with hopefully a beautiful sunrise in the back. Well, that didn't really work. But I still managed to tell you something about how I bracket the shots. So that is how I take a photo with a base exposure, one exposure for the shadows and one exposure for the highlights. This week, as always, we're gonna go into the computer more and talk a bit more about why do I bracket these shots actually, and how do I merge them together into a photo that I can use. Well, all these things we're gonna go through hopefully in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And let's see what I can teach you today. Now, why would you actually make 3 photos, combine them into one, then edit that one? Why can't you just have one photo which has that complete range that you want? Because this is about the dynamic range in your photo. Let me explain this a little bit. A dynamic range in this case is about details in either the shadows or the highlights. So let's put it in a range this time. Let's take complete black on this end of the spectrum and complete white on the other side. Now your eyes can almost see that complete range from blacks to whites. I know in the dark I can't see all the blacks, so I lose a bit of that. And in a super bright day, as I had a couple of weeks ago, I can't see all the highlights as well. So your dynamic range in your eye is about this, and everything just outside of that either comes completely black or completely white. You just can't see any detail in there anymore. But your camera isn't that good as your eye. Your camera can only see about, say, this portion of that dynamic range, and that really depends on the camera you have. Generally, the more expensive cameras have a bit more dynamic range, the cheaper ones a bit less. It depends on a lot of things. We're not going to go into that for now. But so your camera only sees this part, and the whole side here is just black. There's no detail anymore in these shadows. And the whole side here is just white. There's no details in these highlights anymore. So what you do by bracketing is taking one photo for that middle exposure, where you have all the details in the middle. But you also take one photo on this side of the range, so for all the shadows, and this whole part is just going to be white. You don't have any details left there, but you do have all those details in the blacks or in the shadows. And you take one exposure on this side of the range, where you have all the details for the highlights, and all this part here is just black. And by combining this part of the range with this part of the range and this part of the range, we get this whole range. We get this whole dynamic range in one photo. Now do look out with this, because as I said, your eye can't see the whole range, it can see a bit less. But by photographing in this way, you can start seeing things that you wouldn't be able to see with your eye in the blacks or in the shadows or in the highlights. So that's one thing to look after, and that's something you mainly do in the editing suite. So I hope that explains why I would want to shoot a bracketed exposure, to capture that dynamic range in its fully, or at least most of it. And we just go for the full range of it, and we can always edit some things out. Always get more data in the field than you actually need. Now let's jump into Lightroom and have a look at how I merge these photos together into an HDR. So I have these 6 photos that I shot last week. I shot more photos, but these were the ones I talked you through. So for this first shot of the Black Church, as I said, we have this middle exposure in this photo, and then I have a shot with all the details in the shadow, where you'll see that all the highlights are blown out. That's this photo. So all the highlights here in the sky, there's absolutely no detail in that anymore, but all the details in the shadows is what I've caught in this photo. And then I have another shot for this side of the spectrum, where I do get all those details in the highlights, where I can see the clouds and everything, but the shadows are just black at some point. You can't see any details here anymore. And now I want to combine these three together. I can show you the other photos as well, by the way. So here again, we have the middle shot with some details in the sky and some details in the shadows. But if you're gonna pull at that, they're gonna look not gonna look good. It's gonna be grainy, or it loses a bit of detail in the color, so you don't want that. So we have that middle exposure. Again, we have a darker exposure where you can really see all those details popping out in the brighter part. So you can see the clouds and the colors and everything like that. And then there's the final shot where you can see that it's exposed for the darker parts, the shadows. I can see a lot of details in the houses, but the sky is just completely white, completely blown out, completely useless. Now the next step is to combine these photos into an HDR in Lightroom. That's the way I do it. You can use other programs for it. You can go very advanced with luminosity masking in Photoshop. But for most of the photos, I find that blending them as an HDR in Lightroom works fine for me. Let's add them together. We're just going to select all of them, right click, go to photo merge, and then HDR, or press Ctrl H. So let's go through this dialog box together. It's not that hard actually. Let's go through it step by step. So on top we have auto align. I always check auto align on. It just makes sure that if your camera moved a little bit, Lightroom will put the photos over each other so they align properly. I always shoot my HDR photos or my bracketed photos on a tripod. I shoot most of my photos on a tripod. But if you do it handheld, do check this as well so they line up properly. Auto settings, I always leave on. I leave them off. I never use the auto settings because Lightroom will put its own settings, and it's always the same settings for your photo. And I want to have my own control. I want to edit myself. But if you want to have a quick baseline, you can click auto settings, but I wouldn't use it. The next step is the deghosting amount. And deghosting is actually something quite interesting. It's when things have moved in your scene like leaves or something, and it tries to blend it together in a nice way. Now, in this scene, nothing moved, so I'm just going to leave it off. I don't want any deghosting in it. But if you have tree leaves, we'll look at that later in another photo, they don't blend that well. And with deghosting, it can fix that, but do be careful with it because it can bring some weird artifacts. It doesn't always look good. We'll get into that a bit later. And then the last step is create stack. So you can choose it to stack photos together in your Lightroom. At the bottom, you have this overview of all the photos in Lightroom. And in that case, you don't see 4 photos next to each other anymore. So the middle, highlight and the shadow exposure and the HDR, but it just stacks them together into one stack. You can unstack them and see all the other photos, but it makes it a bit clearer and easier in Lightroom. So we're going to click merge to merge these 3 photos together. So now we created this stack of images. So you see a 4 here, which means there's 4 photos in this stack. And on top is the HDR image that we just made. Now this is the photo you can see now, and it doesn't look much different than the photos we had before, right? But if I go into the sliders, you can see that there's a lot more detail to work with. So like in the exposure, if I pull that down, you can see all the details that I still have left in the highlights here. But I can also pull it the other way, make it brighter, and then I have all the details that are there in the foreground, in the shadows, which is the foreground in this case. But what I would usually do is just pull down the highlights so the bright parts get a bit less bright, and pull up the shadows. And this is a bit of a finicky thing. Figure out where it feels unnatural. So do watch out with this highlights and shadows, pulling those outwards, because at some point it just doesn't look real anymore. Remember what I said in the beginning, your eye cannot see a complete dynamic range of blacks to whites. It can see just a bit less, and now we're pushing everything in to that HDR, So watch out that you keep a bit of the part that's too dark and a bit that's maybe too bright, while you still have that detail that you want. So I'm gonna pull it back a little bit. This one as well. I'm just gonna darken it down. So I'm gonna work with this a bit. I'm not gonna take you through this whole edit because that's not what this video is about. This video is about merging them together. You saw how I merged them together, and now you can go edit them. Do whatever you want with it. Okay, so now let's also have a look at the dangers of merging photos together like this, making a bracketed shot, and when it's not right to use it, because there are conditions when it does get tricky. And that's mainly when you're photographing on a windy day and you're photographing trees. The leaves are moving around, and within that 3 shots you've taken, the leaves have moved within the shot. It doesn't really work together in the shot, and that's when deghosting comes in. Now I can show you these photos here. This is a photo I shot a year ago or something, a bit more, at Oud-Reemst in the Netherlands, and I just love that light that's falling on the tree on the left side. So as always, I shot a bracketed exposure like I did last week. So you have this middle exposure here. There's an exposure for the beautiful colors on the horizon, and there's, as you can see, there's no detail left in the tree anymore, in the shadows. And I shot an exposure where I have all those details in the tree, but the rest is completely blown out. But as you can already see here, the leaves have moved and have shifted. So when I merge them together, like I did in the last photo with no deghosting, I get this result. And if I zoom in here a bit, ooh, that is horrific. That does not look good. I don't know what I did exactly. I don't want to know, but it blended it together and it made weird corners of it. It just looks horrible. It doesn't work. So this is when deghosting comes in. Now I turned on the deghosting to high for this blend. And as you can see, it's crisp. It's very dark. I think it took the darkest exposure or something, or I don't know which one, or the middle maybe. But the leaves actually do look good. It does work quite well. There are a couple of points where you can kind of see that something's happening, but it's a lot better than the other one. So I'm quite surprised by this actually. I didn't know it would work this good. So that's when you would use deghosting, but still when it does that, do have a really good look. Or when you choose deghosting, have a really good look if it actually did the right thing for you. So to wrap up, we shoot an HDR bracket or a bracketed exposure. There's multiple ways you can call it, to capture as much of that dynamic range as possible in a couple of photos. I choose 3 photos with 2 stops below and 2 stops above, but you can do 5 photos with 1 stop in between. It does the same thing in the end, as long as your camera can catch that dynamic range. So that's why we do it. It's easy to add them together in Lightroom. You might have a bit more control if you want to do it with luminosity masking in Photoshop, but this is just an easy way. I generally do it like this actually. If you want to have a better look at luminosity masking, I can advise you to have a look at Nick's Page's courses. I did one as well. I have to practice it way more to get better at it, and it's very powerful. You can do a lot with it. I will link it in the description below. But for me, generally these HDR blends are fine. They work good enough. They give me the raw file that I need to work on with that amount of dynamic range that I want. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was useful for you. You probably have shots like this as well, where you have a bright part or a darker part, and it doesn't have to be at sunrise or sunset. It can also be during the day in a forest or something. So I wish you all good luck with merging your own photos, and I hope to see you next week where we're out in the snow. It's a very snowy week next week. I filmed it last week and it's coming next week. Just never mind. Go look, have a look. If you like it, please let me know below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you know what to do. Thank you all for watching. I hope to see you next week. Goodbye.